Hello there, thrill seekers. In my previous episode, I mentioned this book, The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli, and I said something like, I don't know if Rovelli knows anything about Buddhism, but he seems to be passingly familiar and blah, blah, blah. Well, I told you I wasn't finished with the book. In the very next chapter that I read, which is called The Scent of the Madeleine, I don't know how you pronounce that, it's a French word, he talks about Buddhism. In particular, he brings up a bunch of quotes from a scripture called the Questions to King Milinda, and he talks about the self and how the self relates to time. And really, it's one of the best explications of being time I've ever seen. And it's more based on Heidegger's idea of being time than on Dogen's idea of being time, but they're kind of similar, and I think it's really good. So I don't want to read the entire thing to you. What I want to read to you is one single section that I found very interesting. Okay, and here is the section. This starts on page 174 in case you're reading along at home. The second ingredient on which our identity based is the same as for the chariot, and he uses the simile of the chariot, which is used in old Buddhism for the self. Like if you take away the axles and the tires and the steering wheel and all the other stuff, which one is the self? You know, it's the conglomeration of all of them together is the self, and that's what Buddhism talks about the self, as in the personal individual self is actually a collection of stuff that we put into a little sack and call self. So he uses that metaphor. In the process of reflecting the world, we organize it into entities. We conceive of the world by grouping and segmenting it as best we can in a continuous process that is more or less uniform and stable, the better to interact with it. We group together into a single entity the rocks that we call Mont Blanc, and we think of it as a unified thing. We draw lines over the world, dividing it into sections. We establish boundaries. We approximate the world by breaking it down into pieces. It is the structure of our nervous system that works in this way. It receives sensory stimuli, elaborates information continuously, generating behavior. It does so through networks of neurons, which form flexible dynamic systems that continuously modify themselves, seeking to predict as far as possible the flow of information intake. Okay, a lot of sciencey stuff there. In order to do this, networks of neurons evolve by associating more or less stable fixed points of their dynamic with recurring patterns that they find in the incoming information, or indirectly in the procedures of elaboration themselves. Okay, more sciencey, but we're getting to the juicy part. You have to get to this part to get to the juicy part. This is what seems to emerge from the very lively current research on the brain. If this is so, then things, in quotes, like concepts, are fixed points in the neuronal dynamic, okay, hard word to pronounce for me, induced by recurring structures of the sensorial input and of the successive elaborations. They mirror a combination of aspects of the world that depend on recurrent structures of the world and on their relevance in the interactions with us. That is what a chariot consists of. Hume would have been pleased to know about these developments in our understanding of the brain. Okay, that's a prelude to the part I wanted to get to, so let's get to it. In particular, we group into a unified image the collection of processes that constitutes those living organisms that are other human beings. Because our life is social and we therefore interact a great deal with them. They are knots of cause and effect that are deeply relevant for us. We have shaped an idea of a human being, in quotes, by interacting with others like ourselves. I believe that our notion of self stems from this, not from introspection. When we think of ourselves as persons, I believe we are applying to ourselves the mental circuits that we have developed to engage with our companions. And it goes on from there, and it's good stuff, and I recommend it. But what I thought was real interesting is this is almost his way of saying something that I've been saying for a while, and I'll try to say what I've been saying for a while, which is, you have an image of your friend. And I did this around Christmas time last year, and so maybe I'll just try that same analogy. So you know a bit about your friend and what she likes and what she doesn't like, and you've seen her in different clothes, and you've been with her to concerts and movies and whatever. So you have some idea what she would want to get for a Christmas present, and you can kind of think of what she'd want to get for a Christmas present based on the image you have built of her. Well, the same kind of thing occurs within us when we build up an image of ourselves. And this is what I've been saying for a couple of years. It's funny to read it in Carlo Rovelli. But the same thing is what we do to create our own self-image. It's the same thing as what we do to create an image of another person. The image you have of yourself is more detailed than the image you have of your friend because you've got access to more information, but it's the same process by which you create the image of another person and you create the image of yourself. So you can kind of predict what they're going to like. You can kind of predict what I'm going to like. I can predict what I'm going to like. I'm going to like getting married. I mentioned that I'm getting married. So I predict that I will like getting married. I hope my prediction is right. My prediction might be wrong. I don't know, but I hope it's right. The same way, you don't know really much more about yourself than you know about somebody you know intimately. It's still a kind of a mystery what this person called me is. That's the point. And it's interesting to read him saying that he believes our self-image is based on our image of other people rather than introspection of ourselves, because that's I think he's right. I never really thought about it in those terms before I read what he said in the book, that this is actually how we create our image of ourselves, but I think it makes perfect sense because I think it's the same darn thing. So this is what Buddhists mean when they say there is no self, and it's the other reason why there's such a confusion, because in some forms of Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism in particular, and specifically in Kodo Sawaki, who was my teacher's teacher, so I'm very kind of closely related, the word self is often used in two ways. So there's the self which doesn't exist, or which is a kind of a fiction that you create, which is what I've been talking about at the beginning of this video, and what Carlo Rovelli is talking about when he talks about it in his book. And then there is a self, which is usually, when it's done in English, in big S. I'm trying to draw an S on the screen for you, or does it go this way for you? I don't know. Anyway, there is that big S self, which is the kind of thing you get to when you strip away all of the other stuff that you think of as self. There's still something left over. That's the interesting thing. There's all this stuff you think of as self, and then there's something beneath that, behind, let's say behind. Behind might be a better metaphorical place for it in the way I'm saying, but it's sort of behind that, looking through it. It puts on the binoculars of small self. Big self puts on the binoculars of small self, and then looks at the world through those, or puts on the glasses of small self and looks at the world through those. But we can take it away and there's still something there, some substrata, which is this kind of gigantic silent self. And that's what the Buddhists are talking about, and that's what we kind of get to when we get to the kind of dig into the deeper layers of Buddhism. And that's probably a thing for a whole other video, although I've talked about this before on this channel. But that's I thought really interesting. I don't know, other than what I just read, how much Carlo Rovelli knows about Buddhism, given the translation of the questions to King Milanda that he references, which is the Ristavis translation, I think. It's a very old translation, very respected translation, but something quite old. So my guess is he's looked into that. Maybe he knows some people who like it, but I can't imagine he's a sort of practicing Buddhist, because he doesn't mention anything like that. So he's a scientist, and he comes to a kind of a conclusion. It's interesting to see the way Buddhism is starting to influence the sciences. I think this is a real fact now. And that doesn't mean it's wrong, just because Buddhists are because scientists are getting influenced by Buddhism, you'd think, okay, well, they're not objective anymore. Well, they weren't objective to begin with, because they were influenced by their Christian backgrounds and by the materialistic philosophy they imbued and by all sorts of other things. But it's interesting to see what happens when Buddhism starts to influence the sciences. And Carlo Rovelli seems to be an interesting guy in that regard. He's very kind of poetic. His books, well, this is the only one I've read so far, but I bought his current book, whose title I've forgotten, to read after I finish this one. And he's an interesting sort of scientist because he brings in the poetry and the philosophy that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about the hard sciences. So I think it's an interesting take on things. And as I said in the video about time and Dogen, this is a pretty good book. It doesn't really seem to reference Dogen's view on time at all, but he comes up with a view on time that I think is remarkably similar to Dogen's view on time. So there you go. Kind of interesting stuff. What's going on? If you want to invest in me getting more interesting stuff to read, like books, you can send money to the URL you're seeing below. But remember, this video is offered to you for free. You can choose not to pay. It's fine. But if you do pay, that is my only way of making a living these days. And so I really appreciate your support. Have a good time all the time. See you later. Bye. Hey, Ziggy. Hey, Ziggy. Ziggy. How you doing in here? You'd rather sit on the floor than sit outside with me? All right, Ziggy.